The blizzard had been talking all night. Not the soft hush of snowfall a man could sleep through, but something older and meaner, a wind that came down off the San Juan peaks like it had a grudge. Eli Calhoun stood at his front door with his rifle in one hand and a lantern in the other, and he almost didn't open it. Almost, she was standing there when he did. Not collapsed in the snow. Standing, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe to keep herself upright, her dark eyes steady even as her body shook. Snow had buried itself in her hair and across the shoulders of her buckskin dress. Her lips were the color of ash. She said 4 words, "I will work." Shelter. Her English was short. Cut to bone. Eli stared at her. Behind him, little Sarah was on the stairs in her nightgown, 8 years old and wide-eyed, clutching the rail with both hands. "Papa," she whispered. "Is she dying?" The woman's knees buckled. Eli dropped the lantern on the porch and caught her under the arms before she hit the boards. She was light, terrifyingly light, and her skin against his hands was cold enough to scare him. He carried her inside and laid her near the hearth, and the fire lit up her face, and he knew it plain. If he had waited 10 more seconds to open that door, she would have died on his porch. What began that night in the San Juan high country was nothing Eli Calhoun had planned for. What started with wariness and frontier suspicion would slowly become something neither of them had a name for, something that would be tested when men came riding through the snow with guns, men who believed they had a claim on her. What Eli chose in that moment would cost him everything he thought he owned. Watch this story till the end. If it moves you, leave a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now let's go back to where it all started. The winter of 1878 came to the San Juan high country of Colorado Territory the way hard things usually come, without warning and without mercy. The peaks above Elk Fork had been capped in white since October. By December the snow lay 6 feet deep in the draws, the creek had locked itself under gray ice, and the only sound most mornings was the stove popping and the wind working at the shutters. Eli Calhoun had built his ranch on the south slope of the ridge because his wife Clara had liked the way the afternoon light came through the pines. That was 4 years ago. Clara had been gone for 2 of them, fever, mid-June. 3 days after the doctor in Durango had said she was improving. Eli had ridden 60 miles to fetch medicine and come home to find her already gone. He did not talk about that. He had learned that talking about it did not help. What he had left was 300 acres of Rocky Mountain pasture, 40 head of cattle he was trying to keep alive through the winter, a border collie named Roscoe who slept under the stove, and Sarah, 8 years old. Clara's brown eyes. Clara's stubborn quiet. Sarah had learned not to ask her father why he sometimes stood at the window and looked at nothing for a long time. She had learned to put a hand on his arm instead. They had a routine, the 2 of them. Up before first light. Eli would build the fire and put water on while Sarah set the table. He would go out and break the ice on the water troughs, fork hay to the cattle, check the fence line closest to the timber where the elk liked to push through in deep snow. Sarah would have porridge ready when he came back in, stomping snow off his boots on the mat Clara had braided herself from rags she'd saved all one summer. It was a good life. A quiet life. Eli told himself that most mornings, and believed it about half the time. The night the woman knocked, the temperature had dropped hard after sundown. Eli had gone out at dusk to check on the cattle and come back frozen through. He'd stoked the fire high and told Sarah to stay close to it. The blizzard came in around 9, not a gradual thing but a wall of wind that hit the ridge like something thrown. Roscoe pushed himself tight against the bottom of the stove and didn't move again. Eli was reading, or trying to read, the same page of the same almanac he'd been on for a week when the knock came. 3 slow knocks. Deliberate, not the frantic hammering of a man in trouble. Considered patient, he picked up the rifle from beside the chair, crossed to the door and opened it. She had been walking for 2 days. Her name was Sona. In the language of her people, the Chiricahua Apache, the name meant golden. Her mother had given it to her because she had been born in the hour when the morning light first touches the ridgeline and the whole eastern sky goes amber before the sun crests. Sona was 22 years old, and she had covered 40 miles through the deepest winter the San Juan country had seen in a decade, on foot, alone, in buckskin and moccasins. She had left because she had to. Her band had wintered near the Piedra River, in the breaks below the mesa, where the canyons cut the worst of the north wind. They had wintered there many years running, but that fall, a trader named Greer had come to the camp with whiskey and the kind of smile that doesn't reach a man's eyes. He had a paper, he said. A paper with marks on it. He told Sona's uncle, the band's headman that season, that Sona had agreed to go with him as his wife. The paper was a lie. Sona had signed nothing. She had been shown a document and asked if she could read it. She said no. Greer had taken that as a yes and written what he liked. Her uncle was not a foolish man. But Greer had 6 armed riders with him and a federal land agent's badge that may or may not have been real, and it was not a time to start a fight the band could not finish. He told Sona quietly, the night before Greer planned to take her, that she needed to be gone before morning. She had taken dried meat, a wool blanket, moccasins with double-thick elk hide soles her aunt had made her, and a knife. She traveled north and west, away from Greer's likely routes, toward the higher country where she judged no one would follow in this kind of cold. She crossed one ridge too many. By the second night she was losing the feeling in her feet. She smelled the wood smoke from Eli's chimney from a quarter-mile out and walked toward it the way a person walks toward the only light there is. She had not come to beg. She had come to bargain. When Eli opened the door, she gathered what English she had and stated her terms as clearly as she could. Work, shelter, and exchange. Then her legs made the decision for her. Eli set her on the blanket nearest the hearth and went to the kitchen for the kettle. Sarah had come down the stairs and was crouching near the woman's feet, looking at her with the frank, fearless curiosity that only children and very honest people manage. "She's not dying, Papa," Sarah said. This was meant to be reassuring. "I know," Eli said, though he wasn't certain of it yet. He heated water and mixed it with a little whiskey from the bottle on the shelf, not enough to warm her too fast, just enough to start the blood moving. He knelt beside her and lifted her hands one at a time, checking the fingers for the hard white patches that meant real frostbite. They were red and cracked, but not frozen through. Her feet were a worse story. He pulled off her moccasins, and Sarah made a soft sound at the sight of them, raw, blistered, the skin split at the heels. "Go get the spare wool socks," Eli told her. "The thick ones." Sarah went without argument. Sona had not lost consciousness. Not exactly. She was somewhere between sleep and waking, her breathing slow and shallow, her face tipped toward the fire. Eli watched her and tried to work out what he was going to do in the morning. He was not a man who hated. He had grown up in Missouri before the war, where Indian hating was common as mud, but his father had been a quiet man who said once that most of what men hated they hadn't taken the time to understand. That had stayed with Eli, the way things do when they come from someone you respect. Still, he was a rancher alone in the mountains with a daughter, and he knew how his neighbors would read this situation. He could not say that knowledge didn't sit heavy. Sarah came back with the socks and handed them over without being asked twice. She sat beside the woman and watched Eli ease the socks onto her ruined feet. "What's her name?" Sarah asked. "Don't know yet. She said words when you opened the door." "Did she speak English?" "Some." Sarah thought about this for a moment. "I think she's brave," she said. Eli looked at his daughter. "Why?" "Because she knocked," Sarah said. "If I was that scared and that cold, I don't know if I would have." Eli had no answer for that. He pulled the blanket over the woman and went to put another log on the fire. She woke before Eli did, which he hadn't expected. He came downstairs in the gray pre-dawn to find her sitting up near the hearth, hands wrapped around a cup she'd found herself and filled from the kettle still warm on the stove. She had folded the blanket. She looked at him steadily when he came into the room. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He stood there a moment. She sat there. Neither of them moved. "My name is Sona," she said. "Chiricahua, my people winter near the Piedra." A pause. "I can cook. I can mend. I can make medicines from what grows here, yarrow, pine resin, others. I know this high country." Another pause. "I will work. Every day. Until spring. If you give me shelter and food." It was the longest speech she'd made. He could tell it had cost her something, that careful accounting of her own usefulness. Eli poured himself coffee from the pot she'd apparently reheated and sat down across from her. "There are people looking for you," he said. Not a question. Her expression didn't change. "Yes, how many?" "A man named Greer. He will have riders." "I cannot say how many." "Why does he want you back?" "He believes I belong to him." She said it without drama, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. "He is wrong." Eli looked at his coffee. "I've got a daughter," he said. "I know. I saw her. If trouble comes here because of you, I will be gone before it comes," Sona said. "If you tell me it is coming, I will go." He looked at her then. Her feet were wrapped in his spare socks. Her hands around the cup were still red and cracked. She had walked 40 miles through a killing blizzard to knock on a stranger's door, state her terms plainly, and offer him something in return for every breath of warmth she needed. He thought about what Sarah had said. She knocked. "You stay," he said. "We'll work out the rest." The first 2 days were careful ones. Eli moved through the house the way a man moves around something he's not sure about yet. He gave her the small room off the kitchen that had been a pantry, then a sewing room, and hadn't been much of anything since Clara died. There was a cot in it, a nail to hang things on, a window that looked out at the snow-buried pasture. Sona did not ask for anything she hadn't been offered, and did not go anywhere she hadn't been invited. She kept to the kitchen and the main room. She helped without being asked, cleared the breakfast things before he'd finished his coffee, swept the floor, mended a tear in Sarah's coat that had been sitting on the chair for 2 weeks. She did these things quietly, without ceremony, the way a person does who is used to working. Sarah shadowed her constantly. Not intrusively, more the way a cat follows a new person in the house, close enough to watch, but not close enough to touch, until they decide it's safe. By the second morning, the distance had collapsed. Sarah had perched herself on the kitchen stool while Sona worked, and a steady low conversation had started between them that Eli could hear from the next room but couldn't quite make out. He told himself he was watching the situation. He was also, if he was being honest, listening to his daughter laugh for the first time in a while. By the end of the first week, the house felt different. Sona cooked in ways Clara never had, dishes that used dried sage and juniper berries and roots Eli didn't recognize, things she had brought in a small bundle tied inside her blanket. The kitchen smelled different in a way that was hard to name. Warmer, maybe, more complicated. The first night she made a stew with dried venison and something bitter and aromatic that he couldn't identify. He had eaten 2 bowls of it without meaning to. Sarah developed a fever the 3rd day, the kind of low-rattling cough that mountain winters specialize in, nothing dangerous but miserable. Sona went to the woodkit by the back door and asked Eli, through a mix of words and gestures, where she might find certain plants. He walked her to the tree line, and she gathered pine tips from the lower branches and yarrow from under the overhang where the snow hadn't reached the dried stalks. She brewed something that smelled like the forest floor and brought it to Sarah with honey mixed in. Sarah drank it because Sona asked her to. She was better in 2 days. Eli had watched all of this. He kept watching. He noticed that Sona never moved through the house as if she owned any part of it. But she also never moved through it as if she were afraid. She had a way of being still, genuinely still. Not the nervous kind, but the kind that comes from being comfortable inside yourself, that he had not seen in a person before. She could sit by the fire in the evening with her mending and be quiet for an hour, and it was a real quietness. Not an absence, a presence. He found himself sitting in the chair across the fire from her more often than he had intended to. One evening Sarah had fallen asleep at the table over her school. Eli carried her up to bed, and when he came back down, Sona was still by the fire and the room was quiet. He sat down. Neither of them said anything for a while. "Your wife," Sona said eventually. "She built this house with you?" "We built it together," Eli said. "She chose the spot." Sona nodded slowly. "My mother chose the place where we made camp in summer. The women know which ground is good." Eli looked at the fire. "What happened to your mother?" "She died 3 years ago." "Sickness," he looked up. She was still watching the fire. "Same," he said. That word sat between them. Not comfortable exactly, but not uncomfortable either. Just honest. He thought of something Sarah had told him once, that silence no longer felt like something that needed filling, and he understood the girl had noticed this before he had. On the 14th night, Roscoe started barking at 2 in the morning. Not his usual "I heard something" bark, but the hard, urgent kind that brought Eli out of bed with his boots on before he was fully awake. He came downstairs to find Sona already at the window, looking out through the frost at the snow-covered yard. She hadn't lit a lamp. "3 riders," she said quietly. "They came from the south. They're at the tree line." "You could see them?" "I heard them. The horses are tired. They've been riding hard." Eli got his rifle and his coat. "Stay in here. Keep Sarah upstairs." "Eli," he turned at the sound of his name, the first time she had used it. "They will not leave easily. Greer is not a patient man." He went out onto the porch. The cold hit him like a fist. The 3 riders were coming out of the tree line now, walking their horses slow across the open ground, and the one in front was a broad man in a buffalo coat with a beard that had ice in it. He had the look of a man who'd been angry for a long time and had stopped distinguishing between his anger and his rights. "Calhoun," the man called out. His voice carried in the cold the way sounds do when everything else is buried in snow. "Name's Greer. I believe you have something of mine inside that house." Eli stood on the porch with his rifle at his side and said nothing. "I've got a legal arrangement with her people," Greer said. "Paper signed. She ran out on it, and that makes her a thief of her own conscience. You hand her over and we ride off peaceful." "Paper or not," Eli said. "She bargained for shelter here, and I gave it. She's not yours to take." One of the riders behind Greer shifted his horse. The other one was moving to Eli's left, slow, like he was just settling the animal. "You got a daughter in there," Greer said. The words landed in the cold and sat there. The door opened behind Eli. He turned, ready to send Sona back inside, and stopped. She had walked out onto the porch herself. She was standing at his shoulder in her buckskin, hands at her sides, eyes on Greer with the same steadiness she'd had at the door 2 weeks before. "You know this mountain," Eli said to her, low enough that only she heard. "Tell me what you need." "I need 15 minutes, she said. He didn't understand yet, but he had learned in 2 weeks that she didn't say things without reason. "Greer," Eli called out, "let's talk this over properly. Come down off your horses." He kept his voice level, kept Greer's attention. At the edge of his vision, Sona slipped off the porch into the dark. She moved through the snow along the back of the house and into the timber, and she knew exactly where she was going. She had been watching the ridge behind the ranch for 3 days, mapping the drainage in the couloirs, noting where the snow loaded heaviest above the south-facing cliff. She climbed in the dark with no lamp, fast, her moccasins quiet in the ridge above the tree line held a cornice. She had looked at it every morning. The east-facing side was loaded 6, maybe 8 feet deep on a crust that had refrozen after a warm afternoon 4 days ago. She found the shelf she'd marked in her mind. She used her knife blade to test the crust at the break point, and what she found told her it would go with pressure. She stepped on it once, hard, at the weakest point. The sound was not a crack. It was more like a low exhale from the mountain, something held a long time finally letting go. The slide that came off the east face of the ridge was not massive, not a full mountain event, but it was more than enough. It swept down the draw on the far side of the south pasture, with a sound like low thunder, and cut the route Greer's men would have needed to flank the ranch on that side. Greer's horses smelled it and lost their minds. The two flanking riders lost all interest in Eli. Greer himself spent 40 seconds fighting a terrified horse and trying to work out what had happened. And in those 40 seconds, Eli had covered the ground between the porch and the nearest rider, and unhorsed him in a way that ended the discussion. By the time Sona came back down off the ridge, Greer and his remaining rider had gone. The third man was sitting in Eli's barn with his hands tied, considerably less convinced of his employer's legal rights than he had been an hour. She came back through the kitchen door, snow in her hair, breathing hard from the climb. Eli was at the stove. Sarah was sitting at the table with her eyes very wide. "Are you hurt?" Eli asked. "No. What did you do up there?" "There was a loaded slope," Sona said. "I knew it would go. I watched it for 3 days. The angle, the crust. I was right." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "You planned that." "I planned that there might be a night like this," she said. "I did not plan everything. I did not plan to be here." Sarah got up from the table and put her arms around Sona's waist. Sona looked down at her as if this was something she needed a second to absorb, and then she put one hand on the girl's back and held her there. Eli turned to the stove and stood with his back to both of them, his hand on the coffee pot, and did not say anything for a while. The man from Greer's party spent 3 days in the barn before Eli rode to Durango and had a conversation with the county sheriff. The sheriff had heard of Greer. The paper Greer carried turned out to be exactly what Sona had said. A document she had never agreed to, in a language she could not read, witnessed by men on Greer's payroll. The sheriff was a methodical man. He sent word south. Greer did not come back. Spring came to the San Juan country slowly that year, the way it does at altitude, not a sudden change but a gradual relenting. The snowpack pulled back from the south facing slopes first. The creek unlocked itself. The first meadowlarks came back to the lower pasture in late March, and Sarah stood at the kitchen window every morning to report their progress. Sona had stayed, not because she had nowhere to go. Her uncle's band had moved their winter camp, and word had reached her through a Ute man who traded at Durango that her people were well. She had somewhere to go. She stayed because she chose to. That distinction mattered to her, and she had made it clear to Eli in her plain and quiet way. She had begun teaching Sarah some Chiricahua words in the evenings, the names of birds and plants, the word for snow, the word for fire, the word for safe. Sarah was quick with language the way children are and practiced relentlessly. She taught Sona, in return, the multiplication tables and how to read the almanac. On evenings when the fire was low and the cabin settled around them, there was a sound in the house that Eli realized, one night in late February, was the sound of a house that had people in it again. He had not let himself think about what that meant for a long time. He thought about it now. It was an evening in April, that mud season between winter and real spring, when the light stays late and the air carries that edge of green that means things are going to grow again. Sarah was asleep. The cattle were in the lower pasture. The stove had burned down to coals. Eli had been turning something over in his mind for weeks. He was not a man who talked around things once he'd made them up. He sat down across from Sona at the table, put his hands flat on the wood, and looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever you answer, nothing changes here. You have a home here for as long as you want one. That's not what the question is about." She waited. "I know you have your people," he said. "I know you have a whole life that was yours before you knocked on my door, and I'm not trying to ask you to trade that." He stopped. He was not doing this gracefully, and he knew it. I am asking if you would be willing to stay. Not as work for shelter, as something more than that. Sona looked at him. The evening light came through the window over the sink and caught the side of her face, and he thought of what her name meant and how it fit. I have been watching you, she said, since the first morning. The way you are with Sarah. The way you fixed the fence in the cold without complaining. The way you turned your back at the stove so I could have a moment. She put both hands on the table. I know what you are asking. And, he said. She was quiet a moment. Outside, one of the meadowlarks was calling its spring call down from the ridge. My people do not decide these things quickly, she said. And I am my mother's daughter. I do not decide them quickly either. She looked at him steadily. But I have not been gone. It was not a yes and it was not a no. It was something truer than either, and Eli understood it for what it was. The same bargain she had offered at the door in the blizzard, stripped to its bones. I am here. I will stay. He put his hand on the table next to hers. Not on it. Next to it. She looked down at his hand, then back up at him, and the corner of her mouth moved the way it did sometimes when she found something almost funny. He left his hand there. She left hers where it was. The meadowlark called again from the ridge. The coals in the stove settled. The house held them in its warmth, and outside, the San Juan country was slowly deciding to be spring. If this story found something in you, leave a like and tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you. Subscribe if you'd like more stories from the frontier, stories of people who found something real in the hardest places. We'll have another one ready for you soon.